living near our waterways that are at risk. Our entire country is paying the price. Current infrastructure gaps are anticipated to cost the United States $3.9 trillion in GDP and 2.5 million jobs by 2025 due to lost productivity. Failing infrastructure will cause U.S. businesses to become less efficient, raising the cost of doing business and forcing those costs onto consumers. From 2016 to 2025, American households are expected to lose, on average, $3,400 in income every year due to infrastructure deficiencies. Despite all these costs, federal infrastructure spending has been on the decline and has failed to come anywhere close to meeting growing needs. If we want American businesses and workers to succeed, we need to start investing in bold structural changes that will strengthen our economy and prepare us for the future. Instead, we just squandered $1.9 trillion on the Republican tax law that overwhelmingly benefited the wealthy and did nothing to improve our nation's economy or prepare us for the future. If we had invested anywhere close to that amount in our nation's infrastructure instead, the impact would have been transformative. That's because in the short term, every $1 invested in improving our infrastructure systems boosts economic output by $1.50 or more, making it a powerful economic stimulus. In the long term, investing in core infrastructure like transportation, transit, and utilities will boost economic productivity and increase economic growth by simplifying supply chains, lowering shipping costs, and reducing roadway congestion. This growth will not only strengthen our nation's fiscal outlook, it will also spur increases in employment and wages for years to come. Since more than 75% of infrastructure jobs are focused on operations rather than construction, many of these jobs will provide long-term stability for working families across the country. The economic case for investing in infrastructure is clear, but the public health aspect alone should compel us to act. As shocking as it still is, we have water systems that are poisoning our families. Lead pipes in Flint, Michigan created a water crisis that caught national headlines and highlighted a shameful failure of government. But it is not an isolated case. Just look at Newark, New Jersey, Portland, Oregon, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Providence, Rhode Island. All have issues with lead contamination in their drinking water, and they aren't the only ones. How is it that in the wealthiest country in the world, it's easier for a millionaire to get a tax cut than for hundreds of thousands of families to get safe drinking water? Our nation's infrastructure bill is overdue, and it's already costing us our health, our safety, and our economic potential. These are investments that, at one point or another, we will have to make if we care about the well-being of our communities and want to remain competitive in the global marketplace. By investing now, we can modernize our infrastructure and incorporate new technologies and greater resilience into our plans. We can address sustainability and public health needs while growing our economy and creating good jobs. This isn't a should do, it's a must do. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on infrastructure's role in a strong economy and how federal investment can provide opportunities for both short and long-term economic growth while preparing our nation for the future. I now yield to the ranking member, Mr. Womack, for his opening statement.
I thank the chairman, and thanks to the panel of witnesses that we have today. Chairman Yarmuth, thanks for holding this very important hearing. From the post roads outlined in the text of the Constitution to the development of the Transcontinental Railroad, from the creation of the interstate highway system to the evolution of our electric grid, Americans have continually shown that we are a nation of builders. Infrastructure is part of the core foundation that has created and moved the America we all know. Today, you'd be hard-pressed not to see the overwhelming impact infrastructure has on our lives. An extensive network of roads, airports, railroads, public transit systems, and waterways is vital to the mobility and the strength of families, businesses, and our economy. As we move forward in the 21st century, it is imperative that our infrastructure keep pace with the people and nation it supports. Thankfully, infrastructure has historically been a priority for both parties. This bipartisan spirit has served our country well, and it will be important as we work to rebuild and renew. There will, of course, be challenges. While the federal government has a vital role to play, empowering state and local authorities to lead on this issue is fundamentally important. On this committee alone, our members represent 36 distinct congressional districts encompassing nearly 27 million Americans, all of whom have different priorities. A rural district in Arkansas might need increased highway lanes for long-haul trucks. A more condensed populated district might be focused on public transportation. This reality is critical for us to recognize as we prioritize scarce federal dollars on the Budget Committee. We have to rethink how we plan, how we fund, and how we build infrastructure. Smart and strategic investments will not only strengthen communities and boost the economy, but also ensure responsible use of taxpayer dollars. My home state of Arkansas is a leader in innovative approaches to infrastructure, whether it's through partnerships with states such as Missouri to obtain funding to complete the critical Bella Vista bypass, or the communities of Northwest Arkansas pooling resources to create and maintain Northwest Regional Airport, the state's airport of the year, or Governor Hutchinson's highway funding plan. The message is clear: infrastructure cannot be built and maintained without continued state and local investment. But it's not just about funding. Government red tape and burdensome permitting regulations have also throttled progress. In Dr. Geddes' written testimony, he explained that these bureaucratic processes take on average over 5 years to complete, with some of those decisions taking more than 2 decades. While it's important to ensure we protect the environment, we must do so in a way that makes these important projects feasible. We will hear today that a highway project may require 10 different federal agencies considering 16 separate permitting decisions to obtain approval. When I was mayor of Rogers, Arkansas, I wanted to work with partners who understood the needs of my city. That is what Washington should be doing: listening, not mandating. We don't need roadblocks or unnecessary directives. What we need is a federal government that acts as a strategic partner, one that bolsters states' efforts, not hinder them. Infrastructure investment will transform and modernize our systems to support American families, create jobs, make U.S. industry more competitive, all while unleashing economic opportunities. So, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you again for holding this very important hearing, and I look forward to hearing from our esteemed panel about how we can do just that. And I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his opening statement. In the interest of time, if any other members have opening statements, you may submit those statements in writing for the record. Once again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The committee has received your written statements, and they will be made part of the formal hearing record. Now you will each have 5 minutes to give your oral remarks. Ms. Haddock, you may begin when you are ready.
Good morning. My name is Carol Haddock, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the Budget Committee. Thank you for inviting me today to participate in this important discussion on the need to invest in our nation's infrastructure. As I said, my name is Carol Haddock, and I currently serve on the Board of Direction of the American Society of Civil Engineers. I am also a licensed professional engineer in the state of Texas. ASCE is the nation's oldest national engineering society and represents over 150,000 civil engineers who serve as the stewards of infrastructure here in the United States and around the globe. In my professional life, I serve as the director of Houston Public Works, a department that is responsible for Houston's public streets, drainage, water, wastewater infrastructure for over 2.3 million Houstonians. In Houston, we are still in recovery from Hurricane Harvey and already facing more challenges from the recent weather events, including severe flood damage just this last week. In 3 days, remnants of Tropical Storm Imelda dumped more than 30 inches of rain in the greater Houston area, making it our most significant storm since Harvey. We are flood weary. We have faced 4 500-year flood events in the past 4 years alone. Our already vulnerable infrastructure simply can't bounce back without major reinvestment. While state and local governments have certainly stepped up to the challenge, I will start by stating that there is indeed a federal government vital role to play in developing and funding a comprehensive solution. Our founding fathers recognized that for reliable interstate commerce, you need reliable infrastructure. Every 4 years since 1998, ASCE has evaluated our nation's infrastructure to provide a comprehensive look at current conditions across 16 categories and assess if we are prepared for the future. We assign letter grades just like you received in school. In our 2017 infrastructure report card, our nation's cumulative grade was a D+. It's not a grade I'd be proud of. Decades ago, even centuries in some cases, we laid the groundwork for our complex system of roads, bridges, water systems, and electrical grids that connect and power our communities. And just like the roof on our home, when you neglect to maintain it for a while, our systems are showing real wear and tear. They've sprung leaks, worn down, and they've become less reliable. It's been clear to the engineering community, and it's becoming even more clear to the greater public, that the U.S. has only been paying about half of its infrastructure bill. Between 2016 and 2025, the investment gap total across the 16 infrastructure sectors is projected at just over $2 trillion. Failing to close that gap risks rising costs, failing business productivity, decreased GDP, lost jobs, and ultimately reduced disposable income for every American family. If these issues are not addressed, poor infrastructure can cost each American family $3,400 a year, or $9 a day in personal disposable income. This money out of our pockets going to car repairs, gas, and time wasted in traffic. This expense is really a hidden tax that we are all paying when the federal government kicks the can down the road. That number reflects a gradual degradation over time, hard to discern. But I'll tell you, coming from Houston, these numbers seem conservative. The opportunity to modernize our infrastructure systems must be done right. We must prepare for the future by utilizing new approaches, materials, and technologies to ensure that our infrastructure is more resilient and sustainable, to extend the life of our existing infrastructure when possible, to expedite repairs or replacement, and to promote cost savings. My career has been in the water sector, and I'm continuously amazed by what my peers are doing to push the envelope of what is possible. New methods and technologies allow plants to treat more wastewater, often discharging a cleaner product back to the environment, turn waste into energy, and help communities to better manage precious water supplies through reuse. It's an exciting time to bring our infrastructure into the 21st century if we finally give it the attention and funding it deserves. However, if we are to achieve lasting progress, the federal government must provide that critical leadership to increase investment from all levels of government and the private sector. To address these needs, our infrastructure investment must increase from the current 2.5% to 3.5% of the GDP by 2025. To get the most return on our investments, ASCE believes that project costs must be considered over the entire lifespan, not just design and construction, but especially operations and maintenance. We also believe that federal investment should not replace, but rather leverage state, local, and private infrastructure investments. We must ensure that infrastructure owners and operators charge, and that Americans are willing to pay rates and fees that reflect the true cost of using, maintaining, and modernizing all infrastructure, including our water, wastewater, transportation, and energy. At a minimum, this Congress must address these federal infrastructure priorities. Fix the Highway Trust Fund. The federal government has always been a leader in strengthening our surface transportation network. ASCE is on record as supporting a 25-cent increase in motor fuel tax. In addition to fixing the Highway Trust Fund, we face a looming crisis with the FAST Act rescission. A $7.6 billion annual reduction will impact all 50 states if nothing is done. Other things Congress must address this year are eliminate the cap on the passenger facility charge at airports and ensure that all funds in the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund are used for their intended purpose. Currently, there are $9 billion in unappropriated funds. ASCE thanks the committee for holding this hearing on a topic that affects the quality of life, economic prosperity, and livelihood of every American. I look forward to answering your questions.
I thank you for your testimony, and now recognize Mr. Coase for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of this committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on the need for federal investment in infrastructure to create communities of the future. I am Christopher Coase, Vice President at Smart Growth America, where I work with over 300 real estate development and investors across the country who are investing in American cities and small towns today. America's crumbling infrastructure is hurting our economy, our environment, and our quality of life. The need for federal infrastructure investment has never been greater. However, how we invest is more important than our level of investment. Currently, our land use and transportation policies has promoted subsidized sprawl, which has become too expensive and unsustainable at a time when we must be focusing on rehabbing and fixing the current system to meet the new challenges of the 21st century. According to a recent 2019 Smart Growth report, office, retail, and multifamily built-in walkable communities have achieved over 75% price premiums over their non-walkable competitors. Whether it's in Louisville, Kentucky, West Jefferson, North Carolina, or within the Boston Metro, we're constantly seeing communities take the lead and embracing a smarter investment strategy in walkable, pedestrian-friendly, and sometimes transit-oriented investments to achieve higher economic and social returns. While investments in transportation and mobility options are critical, unfortunately, it's not sufficient. In SGA's core values, why American companies are moving downtown, we have learned that Fortune 500 companies, startups, manufacturers are moving to communities that have a great quality of life for their employees. This includes transportation options, but employees are also attracted to places and locations with vibrant neighborhoods that feature affordable housing options, restaurants, nightlife, and other amenities that really require a walking distance or a short drive. Unfortunately, there is a widening gap between American cities and small towns that have the right infrastructure mix, the right housing mix and amenities, and those that do not. When identifying areas ripe for opportunity fund investments, we discovered that only 2% of all the opportunity zones met the market demand for walkable places and locations that have reliable access to job markets. This means over 20 million Americans living in opportunity zones today for the last several decades have been forced to spend more than half of their household income on housing and transportation, thus limiting their ability to save, invest in themselves, or support local businesses, which is what we do in real estate. Thinking about housing and transportation together reflects how people actually live, and it is critical to understand the enormous upfront infrastructure cost barrier to neighborhood revitalization and attracting new private investment in our communities today. Now is the time for federal investment in holistic neighborhood retrofit policies that encourages greater private investment in infrastructure, that promotes mixed-use development, and encourages mixed income and affordable housing when possible. This is why Locus is working with several members of the House Ways and Means Committee to create new incentives to support neighborhood rehab projects that include public infrastructure costs beyond those associated with specific buildings, while rewarding those projects that include attainable housing. To make communities investment ready, federal investment has to go beyond just roads, bridges, and transit, but it has to be about modernizing our schools, brownfields, our water infrastructure, and rural broadband. Additionally, as climate change intensifies, federal investments must ensure our communities are more effective in being economic and physically resilient and maintaining mitigation to those effects. Lastly, federal infrastructure investments should be based on a national vision that in America, no matter where you live or who you are, you can enjoy living in a place that is healthy, prosperous, and resilient. This vision will require new lines of and new forms of partnerships between the federal government, the private sector, in order to also shift the current infrastructure paradigm focused on a handout to a way out. If we do this, I believe we can help communities become more vibrant and resilient while ensuring future investments address and not exacerbate the historic inequities that we find in rural America, communities of color, and low-wealth communities. In closing, I would like to thank the committee for this opportunity to speak on the need for a smarter federal infrastructure investment strategy and sharing our ideas on how the private sector could be a partner to achieve that. Thank you.
And I thank you for your statement. And now, Mr. Tamer, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to appear before you today. It was obviously really easy to prepare for this speech after such a slow news day yesterday, so thank you for the timing too. I want to thank you for tackling such an essential topic, the future of American infrastructure and the federal policy frameworks that manage and invest in those networks. I want to spend my time this morning focusing on some of the broader themes that are in my written testimony. The past few years have been a really dynamic time for the topic of infrastructure reform. Seemingly all at once in major newspapers that don't normally cover the topic, we're hearing a growing consensus about the need to support infrastructure modernization through congressional action. That's a really positive development. Infrastructure is an essential enabler of economic growth, whether serving as a platform for industrial innovation, fostering social opportunity, or protecting the natural environment. Simply put, effective infrastructure policies drive national success. And with these calls for infrastructure reform, Congress gets a truly once-in-a-generation opportunity to physically shape the future of our country. But what does genuine reform look like? And I genuinely mean that question. What outcomes does Congress hope to achieve? I respectfully submit to all of you that the primary answer cannot be spend more. The conversation cannot start with the amount of money we are going to invest. It's true that some of our infrastructure systems require capacity expansion, significant upgrades, digital modernization, and that more spending is typically warranted. It's also true that federal spending levels as a share of GDP are less than decades past. But the amount we spend on infrastructure should not be the primary reason to motivate reform. Spending is not an outcome. Spending is an output. Our problem, actually, is waywardness. When the nation gets a collective feeling that we need to reform policy frameworks, whether it's healthcare, education, infrastructure, when we can all sense something is amiss, it's a telltale sign that our current policy frameworks aren't delivering outcomes we want. That collective feeling isn't about spending. It's about a deeper set of collective failures. And this is the exact state of infrastructure policy, especially at the federal level. A lack of clarity around exactly what we want to achieve. Consider what motivated the federal policy frameworks that we all follow today. Their authors crafted policies that respond to the challenges of their time. Issues like connecting cities across state lines, delivering telephone and cable lines, and stopping sewage dumping into our rivers and streams. If you were to start from scratch today and write a fresh set of national objectives, a set of concepts that could bring prosperity to all people, for business success, genuine stewardship of our natural environment, is that the list you would write? Do you feel like we lack city-to-city connectivity in this country right now? Are there not enough telephone cables in our communities anymore? The truth is we've long outgrown these objectives, much of it due to our own prior success. The federal government and their public and private partners built out the networks we dreamed up on paper. But today, we have new challenges, ones just as serious as our predecessors. Income and wealth inequality have skyrocketed to levels we haven't seen since the Gilded Age. Digitalization is rapidly reshaping entire industries in the regions where businesses call home. The climate is undergoing changes we cannot afford financially to ignore. And finally, local fiscal capacity is stressed in the face of regional economic divergence. I respectfully submit that our conversation should start here, with a frank debate about the outcomes we want to achieve. Congress and your partners and the general public have a truly special opportunity. We can define these new outcomes, a new set of goals, and reorient our policies to achieve them. I recognize this is not easy work. Current legislation is just sitting there, staring all of us in the face, and the shortest path is to edit it along the margins. From a political perspective, that's a sensible move. But it will not directly attack those same challenges, nor will it magically bring new outcomes to the fore. For that, we have to be open-minded and consider entirely new approaches. So what do I mean? Here's just a few short examples. If transportation is steadily damaging our climate more each year, if the loss of open land is leading to longer commute times and higher infrastructure bills, is it time for the federal government to seek a more hands-on approach to land use policy? If inequality is a sizable issue and people cannot even afford basic services, should we develop an affordability lens to how we structure infrastructure policy? If economic competitiveness is lagging, if we want more entrepreneurialism and well-prepared workers, and we're not leveraging all the data that's out there, should we enact a robust digitalization program? Developing and building consensus around clear outcomes can serve as a jumpstart to the reform conversations we all want to have. But this all starts with a fresh perspective. If we want to maximize value from the infrastructure networks we've already built and strategically prioritize the networks we will build in the future, we need to escape the path dependencies we've built for ourselves and adopt a new set of economic, social, environmental goals. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you very much for your statement. And now, Dr. Geddes, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Yarmouth, Ranking Member Womack, and distinguished members of the committee, Thank you very much for the opportunity to appear today before the committee on the topic of America's infrastructure. My name is Rick Geddes. I'm a professor in the Department of Policy Analysis and Management at Cornell and founding director of the Cornell Program in Infrastructure Policy. I'm also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I want to make several key points during my oral remarks. First, the United States faces severe challenges in the funding, financing, and permitting of its heavy civil and social infrastructure. Although funding and financing of infrastructure are related, they are conceptually distinct. The main challenge the United States faces today is inadequate funding of infrastructure, which refers to the underlying dollars needed to pay for it. Declining revenue from the federal gas and diesel tax is devolving responsibility for funding to state and local governments by default. Second, the United States can adopt innovative approaches used successfully in many other countries to help state and local governments fund and finance their infrastructure. Those include encouraging more private involvement through public-private partnerships, encouraging greater funding on their own through value capture, and creating an asset recycling program. Finally, I urge Congress to address the exceedingly long time periods required to get projects permitted in the United States. Regarding funding for infrastructure, taxes on gas and diesel fuel, which provided a reliable funding source for decades, are now under stress. They are typically not indexed to inflation at the state or federal level, and they generate less revenue as drivers shift into more fuel-efficient vehicles, and some vehicles that don't use fossil fuels at all. That is putting a strain on state transportation budgets at a time when infrastructure is aging and in need of expensive repairs and upgrades. I suggest several key reforms to help state and local asset owners operate and maintain the nation's infrastructure. The first is to encourage state and locals to engage in value capture. Value capture is the concept that infrastructure assets that have been maintained in the same way for decades can generate more value through innovative approaches to management and release enormous latent value in those assets. One simple example is to move the location of salt sheds along highways that may have been in the same place for decades. The value of that real estate that the sheds are on may have gone up over time. You could move the shed to a lower valued parcel and then lease or sell the real estate that the shed was on before. That's one example. Another example, which requires federal action, is to allow states to develop interstate highway rest stops. Section 111 of Title 23 of the United States Code prohibits states from including shops and restaurants and other commercial activity at hundreds of highway rest stops, which is a restriction going back to the 1950s. If states had the option of developing those rest stops, they could concession out the food, concession out shops, and they could gain new funding for infrastructure via those concession fees. The question is how to incentivize such value capture through a comprehensive program. I here suggest Congress follow the successful example of Australia, which created an asset recycling program a number of years ago. Under this program, the federal government of Australia gave state and local asset owners a bonus, 15% in the Australian case for every dollar they raised via value capture in the program. Critically, the program is called asset recycling because the newly raised funds from the program are always plowed back into the infrastructure owned by that same jurisdiction. That is, they don't go into some other use. In Australia, each dollar spent in the 15% bonus generated roughly 5 times that amount in funds released due to new value created by the program. I also recommend a set of reforms to encourage greater state and local use of public-private partnerships or PPPs. PPPs can leverage private capital, expertise, and other benefits that help scarce transportation and infrastructure dollars go as far as possible. Many other countries, including Canada, Spain, France, and Australia, are decades ahead of the United States in PPP use. There are several key reforms that would help incentivize PPP use in the United States. First, lift or eliminate the current $15 billion cap on private activity bonds, or PABs, which level the cost of capital playing field between the private sector capital and the public sector capital. Second, private activity bonds should be approved for use on all public purpose infrastructure, including water projects, energy projects, and not just transportation projects. Third, Congress should encourage the creation of state and regional PPP units. PPP units are quasi-governmental entities that help state and local governments complete PPPs that are in the public interest. I'll just close out by saying that infrastructure delivery at all levels is hurt by very slow environmental permitting. I believe that that permitting process could be assisted through the one federal decision concept, which would create a lead agency in the permitting process, set a target of 2 years, and the permitting would go through the agencies concurrently and not sequentially in order to expedite that process. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for your testimony. Now we will begin the question and answer section of the hearing. The ranking member and I will defer our questions to the end, so I now recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Moulton, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Yarmouth, I ask unanimous consent that the testimony of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials be inserted into the record.
Without objection.
I'd like to begin by citing two things the ranking member said in his opening statement. The first on bipartisanship, and the second on differing priorities of districts around the country. As ranking member, if I have it right, you said, my home state of Arkansas needs increased lanes for long-haul trucks, whereas other more urban communities may need more investment in public transit.
Correct.
First, I would like to point out that highways are just as public as public transit. Neither would exist without government investment. And it's the lack of government investment that's gotten us to the embarrassing state of America's infrastructure we know well today. Second, the ranking member is right. The transportation and infrastructure investment has historically been a bipartisan priority, and it must be going forward. In recent years, however, even this topic has become partisan, with the conservative billionaires in the Koch family running campaigns in urban areas against transit initiatives because they negatively impact the car and oil economy. Third, and closely related, we need to start making infrastructure investment decisions based on facts, on real numbers, and truly understanding the long-term costs and benefits, and the impacts these transportation and infrastructure investments have on other parts of our lives, on public health, on community health, on economic development and economic opportunity. I will use one example. Virginia has recognized that one of the best ways to deal with the congestion caused by long-haul trucks on our highways, which the ranking member cited as an issue in Arkansas, is to invest in railways, something the federal government has scarcely done since the 19th century. One single train can easily carry 300 trucks. And for those of us who support a free market approach to transportation, we ought not only subsidize highways when rail is safer, more efficient, and better for the environment. Let's invest in both and give the market a level playing field. Likewise, investing in traditional transit in urban areas isn't always the right answer either. Modern transit systems in Japan look almost nothing like the old-fashioned diesel commuter trains my home state government of Massachusetts wants to buy more of as we speak. So let's make sure we're making investments not based on the status quo, not simply repairing our roads and bridges as we always hear, but truly making smart, fact-based, business-savvy investments in 21st century infrastructure after examining all alternatives on the table. Little Rock is 2.5 hours from Chicago in all weather with no delays and a nearly perfect safety record by high-speed rail at Chinese speeds, which is something that every developed country in the world is investing in except the United States. So let's have a fresh perspective, as Mr. Tomer said, and have a broader conversation. Mr. Coase, I'd like to begin with you. Earlier this year, I worked with Professor Linda Bilmes from Harvard Kennedy School to examine the budgetary and non-budgetary costs of the road economy. She found that in Massachusetts, direct budgetary spending on roads is nearly $6 billion per year, and indirect annual costs, including accidents, congestion, carbon emissions, pollution, and injuries, total approximately $20 billion. Now, this does not include the full economic costs of the road economy, which are estimated about $150 billion more. Mr. Coase, how can we improve funding decisions to examine the full impact of different modes of transportation?
Great question, Congressman. There are a number of strategies we would recommend that at the federal level, but particularly at the state level, working with MBTA, also with some of your local partners. One of the first strategies that we find across the country is that many jurisdictions, also here at USDOT, do not do physical impact analysis on those infrastructure projects. So I would emphasize the need for every time we spend a new dollar on infrastructure, that we have a full comprehensive review of not only the, as my colleague to my right suggested, just on the design build, but also the net impact on surrounding communities. One of the second elements I would say is something we've been doing for a number of communities across the country is scenario planning. As we're thinking about new infrastructure investments, we actually provide a connection between the transportation investment and the land use and the wholesale impact. And that actually provides a much better picture of both not only the tax revenue implications, but also the fiscal impacts on local revenue. So those are just two simple strategies that both USDOT as well as state DOT should be incorporating to cover the full cost of those investments.
And I would just close by saying that that sounds really smart, and we just need to make sure we do it in an efficient way like Dr. Geddes recommends, so that we don't just have a lot of bureaucracy, but we can truly understand the full economic cost of these decisions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Smith, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll say it one more time. I say it every time that we are having a hearing in this committee. It's been 157 days since we were supposed to pass a budget. This committee has not even presented a budget, and that is the sole purpose of this committee. Nancy Pelosi, Speaker Pelosi, said that a budget is a statement of your party's values. Yet she refuses to even have one member of her party to file a budget to show the values of her party. Is her values of her party infrastructure? We're having hearings on it, but they're not filing a budget. I'm asking them to file a budget. This is the budget committee, so we could discuss a budget. It's been 157 days since it was supposed to have been passed, not filed. If we're going to talk about infrastructure, I think we need to talk about the inequality, not of wealth, but the inequality between rural versus urban. That's a huge issue that a lot of folks just don't want to look at, but it's a real issue. I represent 30 counties in southeast Missouri, everything 20 miles south of the city of St. Louis to about 20 miles east of Springfield, Missouri. We call it the Boot Hill of Missouri. 9 of my 30 counties don't have 911 service in their county. You're talking about better roads and bridges, which is needed. My people need to have 911 service. That's about public safety. That's inequality. The folks in rural Missouri deserve to have the same public safety that the folks in the urban areas have. The problem is 9 out of those 30 counties don't have 911 service in their county. But guess what? They don't even have cell phone service to call 911 in the counties that we do have 911 cell service, 911 providers. We hear people on the other side talk about 5G, how we need 5G. We need some kind of connectivity in rural America. And so I think when we're talking about infrastructure, that is the first item in priorities that we need to talk about. There are Americans that have worse cell phone service than the people in the jungles of Colombia. That's a problem. And so if we actually don't want to leave anyone behind, and if we want to care about inequality, look at rural versus urban. It is a real issue. And I challenge anyone on that side of the aisle to stand with me and try to address the rural versus urban divide, because it's real. It is absolutely real. The health and safety of the people in rural America, they should have 911 service. They also should be able to have internet service. And you know what? They should be able to have nice highways. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to build new highways because we also have the National Forest. And because of the National Forest, there's so many. There's over 70 different environmental procedures you have to go through in order to build a new shoulder, let alone a new lane on a highway in numerous counties in my congressional district because we have part of the National Forest. My people shouldn't be left behind because of government policies or just because it's a zip code that they've lived in. My family's lived in this area for 7 generations. It is my home. We were there before Missouri was even a state. And the opportunity that is with my friends and neighbors, should be the same opportunity that anyone that decides to live in a big city. And so when we're talking infrastructure, Mr. Chairman, that needs to be the front priority about health and safety on infrastructure. I want to point out, we all know Hoover Dam. Hoover Dam took roughly 5 years to build. That was in the early 1930s, during the Great Depression. If you stand on Hoover Dam and you look over and you see that big bridge, that bridge was built in the 80s, started in the 80s. But it took almost 2.5 decades to build because of the environmental policies and the permitting processes in order to get it. These are areas that we can transform to help make things happen quicker, more efficient. With that, Mr. Chairman, I see my time has expired and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentlelady from Minnesota, Ms. Omar. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Sears.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I come from a very different district than my colleague. Just to give you an idea, I come from a town that is 1 square mile and it's got 53,000 people on it. And the town next to it is 1.5 square mile, it's got about 70,000. And then there's Hoboken, New Jersey, which is a 1 square mile, which is another 53,000 people. Our priority is obviously moving people. We have a very old infrastructure. Many people in that district go to where the jobs are, which is New York. We have every form of transportation you can think of. And the latest one is those little scooters that go around all over Hoboken. Okay, so we have every kind of infrastructure. And the infrastructure is very old. And obviously, states have to contribute to fixing the infrastructure. But there has to be an assistance to those states. New Jersey just raised the gas tax to 41 cents above what it was because the Transportation Trust Fund was being depleted from poor management and people tapping into the Transportation Trust Fund. So any kind of money that is ever put on gas has to be a dedicated fund and only be used for transportation. It cannot be a piggy bank where people can go in there in any of the states or even the federal and try to take money out of it. I've been fighting for the Gateway Tunnel, which is a big project in my district. I also been fighting for the Portal Bridge. The Portal Bridge in my district is 110 years old. It is the lifeline of the Northeast Corridor. It's 110 years old, and when you open it, sometimes it doesn't lock properly, and they have to use a sledgehammer to put it together. New Jersey has committed $600 million to fixing this. It cannot do it all alone. So, Mr. Thomas, when you say that money is not everything, it has to stop. I'm wondering, do we freeze the money and rethink everything? I mean, states just can't do these things by themselves. And mind you, the Gateway Tunnel and the Portal Bridge, we are in a region that generates 20% of the GDP of this country. And it's a region that sends money to Washington year in and year out. We're not one of these, well, I don't want to say what my friend calls them, but we do generate a lot of money. So when you talk about freezing the money, we don't need any more money, I can't agree with you. I mean, in Houston, obviously what they went through, they need help. And even though Texas is a rich state, I get it, but they generate also money that comes to Washington. So some of the money has to get back. And believe me, I've been in state government, and and I know about regulations. I know about governments that it's impossible to work with. It took me months just to get a bus stop put in across the street from where I live because New Jersey Transit wasn't moving fast enough. So I do get that we have to reform and speed up our permitting. But I just cannot agree with you, Mr. Thomas, that we don't need more money. You know, we definitely need the assistance of the federal government. I think in New Jersey, it's not just the turnpike. I hate to bring that out to everybody. You know, we're not just the turnpike. But the turnpike is getting very expensive, and 35% of the traffic on the turnpike comes from out of state. So when they increase the tolls, I don't mind too much, because a lot of the people do contribute to it. But it's just, states are just being overburdened with the infrastructure being so old, and they need assistance. It's not that, you know, that we just want to throw money at these projects. We need the federal government to step in and assist so people can continue, or these regions can continue to send money to the federal government here. Because when you generate 20% of the GDP of this country in a region, I think they deserve a second look when they have an infrastructure project that they need help on. So I was going to ask you a question, but I talked too much. Thank you.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to all the witnesses for being here today. You know, from that little mule farm I was born and raised on to my 27 years in the Air Force and as a small business owner and then my work in corporate America, here's what I learned. No matter what the system is, whether it's the human system that we walk around in every day, our bodies, a transportation network, an IT system, an automobile, about 75% of the life cycle costs from cradle to grave of a system is in operations and maintenance. It's easy to put those systems in place. It's much, much harder to keep them up. And so there is no question that improving our nation's infrastructure will lead to greater economic growth and the development of rural America. And Congress has a responsibility to provide the states certainty so that they can build and maintain infrastructure that our communities need. Rather than kick the can down the road again, Congress should work together across the aisle collectively in a bipartisan way to find a permanent, sustainable solution for the Highway Trust Fund. And we got to do it in a way that doesn't put the burden on those that are the most needy. Look at rural America. I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand and I agree that those that use the highway system, they're the ones that need to help pay for it. I get that. But who are the ones that are the most disproportionately affected by a use tax when we do that? It's those that live in rural America that have to drive 30, 45 minutes to get to work or to the hospital or to the grocery store to check on mom and dad. So we got to make sure that we go about this the right way. Dr. Geddes, I believe Congress should consider a variety of possible solutions, and I got some ideas of my own, but in your opinion, what are some of the options for providing a permanent funding source for the Highway Trust Fund?
Yes, so thank you, Congressman. The Highway Trust Fund was a tremendous benefit to the United States. Federal gas taxes were increased heavily in 1956 to pay for the design and construction of the interstate highway system, and for decades it provided a reliable funding source. Now we've got vehicles, some of which don't burn gasoline at all, or fossil fuels, some which get wildly different.
And people in inner cities aren't driving that much. They're taking mass communication or riding bikes to work or walking to work or whatever, right?
Right. One issue with the Highway Trust Fund, of course, is fairness or equity. And back in 1956, we talk about both horizontal and vertical equity, if I may. Horizontal means if you use something, you pay in proportion. If you use certain kilowatt hours of electricity, you pay in proportion to use. And the Highway Trust Fund was like that back in 1956. A Buick sedan got about the same as a Chevy sedan, et cetera. But now, of course, technology has changed that, right? Because it's the same four-door sedan. One could be old, one could be electric, and they pay wildly different in the gas tax. The other is the vertical equity, and that's the notion that wealthier people would pay more. right? And now we have wealthier people who own a Tesla pay nothing in gas taxes. A poor person with a Ford, or family with a Ford F-150 pickup truck would pay a lot more. So in both the vertical and horizontal senses of fairness, it seems like the gas tax idea has become weaker over time. So that's why in my testimony, in my research, you mentioned it, I'm moving towards more user fees. So most economists like prices or rates or fees, and the idea of allowing state and locals more pricing and tolling is a standard, and was pilot programs in the last highway bill to encourage that. Yeah. So if we move to a new system, I would very much like it to be a user fee-based system, but subject to what you just said about fairness issues, right? So that we're not disproportionately charging poor or urban, whatever the group is, more than the others.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
I'm sorry, that's my long answer.
No, I appreciate that. You know, I believe any discussion on infrastructure, we talk about the Highway Trust Fund, but one of the other really critical, important rural infrastructure issues is broadband. And building out broadband. I know that's not funded out of the Highway Trust Fund, but in rural areas like eastern and southeastern Ohio, where most of my district, 6.5 hours long, from an hour outside of Cleveland to an hour outside of Cincinnati, most of my district has inadequate broadband service in a digital economy. That's a death knell in the coffin of rural communities. So we got to work on that too. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses. I want to start with a couple of agreements. I want to agree with Mr. Tomer that we ought to fund outcomes, and we ought to identify where we want to go before we start spending money on it. There is a new move to resurrect earmarks, so-called congressionally directed spending, and that is all about funding projects in your district. And I think even beyond that, some people just think about throwing money at projects without thinking about the results you get. So I want to endorse your analytics as a way to approach this. I also want to, Mr. Smith has gone, my colleague from Missouri, but I think that regulatory reform has to be part of this. We should not be throwing away money on permitting that's needless when we know what we want to do. I mean, I think we can achieve high standards. We should aim for high standards. Sometimes we can do that much more efficiently. We ought not to be imposing extra costs on taxpayers when we don't need to. And I think that's certainly something we should be open to talking about on both sides of the aisle. Mr. Coase, I want to know, you talked about building smarter, denser neighborhoods. What is the federal government's role in that? What do you think that we could do? I think that's largely a local issue, but how can the federal government provide support and the right incentives for that?
Well, thank you for that question. So first and foremost, what we are finding from the private sector market in terms of creating these walkable urban places, whether it's in downtown Thomasville, Georgia, or Bentonville, Arkansas, is that oftentimes to build that mixed use or two-story building, you have to improve the water infrastructure. You have to improve the stormwater infrastructure. But if you do a real estate deal, oftentimes you can't generate revenue off that infrastructure in the first couple of years. So what can the federal government do? Well, actually, in the FAST Act, the federal government actually said it will provide low interest loans to local communities and real estate communities who are trying to rehab rural main streets or transit-oriented development. Now, unfortunately, the bureaucracy has not allowed residents or local communities and real estate development communities to actually access those dollars. But by providing low interest loans that have a longer timeline than your traditional capital markets, you can actually finance those rural Main Street infrastructure improvements as well as COD. Now, the flip side of that is that that's also an opportunity to generate new revenue for the federal government through value capture, because private sector just needs a longer timeline to finance infrastructure. But because what I've mentioned earlier in our research, we're seeing, whether it's in Thomasville downtown, whether it's in Louisville along the BRT-Dixie Highway where the BRT line is coming in, when you increase density, when you bring people closer to their jobs, when you bring them closer to their churches, when you bring them closer to their mom and dad, you actually increase the value. You actually allow people to have more money in their pocket. As a real estate developer, that means we can charge more rents, the land values go up, and guess what? If the federal government was actually a real partner, you can actually take some of those resources and reinvest it back in infrastructure across the country.
Right.
And right now, we're missing a real partner.
So I agree with that. I think that makes sense. I think the thing that we should do, this is consistent with the bill I've introduced called Build More Housing Near Transit Act. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but the idea is that The federal government should ask communities in which we invest, what are you going to do to make sure that there's ridership on this investment that we're providing for you? And that supports the idea of building communities closer in, not reproducing, but rather repairing infrastructure that's existing. And I think we should do the same thing with things like investments in what are quintessentially local things like water and sewer. If we're going to help, we have to expect back results that help us on the budget side and help us achieve our objectives. I also wanted to say that I don't think it's all about money. I think it's naive to think that there's not a lot of money involved. And I want to just note that the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimates that spending $1 trillion on infrastructure, if it's debt financed, would actually shrink GDP in the long term because of the effect of debt. We have gone too long in this room and in this building without talking about how to pay for stuff. We had a tax cut that was tremendously irresponsible. But I think over the last few years, the notion of paying for things has kind of gone out of fashion to our detriment, and I think that's wrong. I wanted to ask Mr. Geddes about what you thought along the lines of a vehicle miles traveled fee. Is that, from an economist perspective, is that the right way to pay for things, given things like the Tesla?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. Absolutely. So there's a long literature going back decades on VMTs. Out west, they call them RUCs, road usage. There's different names. Yep. Road usage charges. There's also mileage-based user fees, MBUF, and the state of Oregon, as we know, has been an absolute leader in implementing and moving, notably, instead of the state gas tax, not in addition to, instead of the state gas tax, they are charging a per mile fee. You know, it's a road usage charge. To the economist, absolutely in favor of it.
I'm out of town. I'm out of time. I also wanted to just mention that a carbon tax with some refunds to deal with underserved areas, I think, is also something we should be considering here, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Roy, for 5 minutes.
Thank the chairman. Thank all the witnesses for taking your time out of your busy schedules to be here and to address this body. I'm particularly grateful to see Ms. Haddock here from my home state of Texas. Thank you for making that trip. I too want to echo my colleague from Missouri's comments about the fact that we are sitting here and have not passed a budget. This is the Budget Committee, and it would seem that that would be the basic duty of our committee to do and for the body to pass a budget. So I would think we should try to get back and focus on that. But I'd also point out that as we sit here, and we've been here about an hour, I don't know, maybe we'll be here another hour, we're racking up $100 million of debt per hour in this country. So while we've been sitting here, there's another $100 million of debt racked up. Next hour, another $100 million of debt. And we just keep ticking along, acting like nothing's going on. Just moving along from impeachment inquiry to press conference to who knows what will be taking up the time of this august body today, besides dealing with the fact that another $100 million of debt has been racked up in an hour. Now, one of my colleagues has suggested, of course, that the significant culprit of this reality is the tax cut 2 years ago. Apparently, in December of 2017, we were running a surplus. Apparently, the tax cuts that were put in place in December of 17 are driving the deficits to epic proportions. Because, I don't know, $1 trillion a year in deficit spending apparently can be made up by $100 billion of an increased revenue on the back of a tax cut change in policy. And it just strikes me as surreal that we continue to get in this infinite do loop about talking about a tax cut, which is put in place to create economic growth and to put more money in the pockets of those that create jobs. And we can have a robust debate about what the right tax rates could be. But don't pretend that we didn't have a massive deficit in December of 17 and that we're going to solve it by throwing a higher tax rate in place, whether it's for businesses or individuals. We're here to talk about transportation instead of those larger issues, but they're all germane. From my standpoint on transportation, representing Texas, and Texas 21 in particular, the I-35 corridor between San Antonio and Austin, Texas is, shall we say, busting at the seams and is going to continue to get worse. And we've got a real problem we're going to have to address there in Central Texas, right? It's massive growth between Austin and San Antonio. We've got 1,000 people a day moving to the great state of Texas, often seeking refuge from other states that are maybe not quite as prolific in terms of economic growth and have higher regulatory climates. I see it every day. A woman came up to me the other day at an event in my district saying, well, I've got no other place to move to, and I just moved here from California. Can you please keep Texas strong? I said, well, every time I go to Washington, I'm trying to keep Texas strong. And I guess one of my questions I would have for you, Mr. Geddes, is there a federal law that prohibits states from being able to do whatever those states want to do for their own infrastructure? I mean, 3/4 of infrastructure spending is state and local, is that right? Give or take?
Right, I think that number is roughly correct, might be closer to 80, but
Okay.
I have to go.
Right.
But your first point, Congressman, is very, very salient. There's a lot of restrictions going back to the 50s and 60s on how states can use the interstate highway system. I just pointed out one in my testimony, which is one of my favorites, which is Section 111 of Title 23, which restricts the development of highway rest stops. And that's why you drive into a rest stop on a dark night, and it may have bathrooms, a few maps, and some vending machines, and that's it. From an economist perspective, that's an enormously valuable asset that the state cannot develop because of this old law. And states have asked for permission, I believe, for that to be relaxed, so that they can, and that's a prime example of value capture that some of us, you can concession out the restaurants, et cetera. And there's other examples I could give.
Well, thank you for that. Sorry, we have such a short time, but and another question here that I think is really important. Some states are donor states, some states are not, right? Is Texas a donor state?
I believe it's a donor.
Texas is a donor
Pretty sure.
state. Texas is
Texas
a
is a
donor state. For gas tax
I know
dollars
New York is a donor.
to the
My
tune of
state's a
about
donor.
$200 million a
Yep.
year, upwards of $1 billion, depending on how you factor in the total backfill that's coming in from general revenue.
Right.
I would also note that we're spending about $500 million a year to secure the border of the United States and Texas because this body fails to secure the border. I'm just pointing out that there's a lot that needs to be done, but I'm just looking at Texas and saying we'd like to get our money back. Thanks.
The gentleman's time has expired, and now I recognize the gentlewoman from Minnesota, Ms. Omar, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member. Thank you all for coming to chat with us today. America has a long history of building some of the most impressive infrastructure systems in the world, and investing in these vital networks is part of what makes this country exceptional. But unfortunately, we're falling behind and have been for several years. Since 2010, China has spent roughly 8% of its GDP on infrastructure, and on average, European countries spend equivalent of 5% of their GDP. But here in the United States, we're only investing about 2.4%. And we have been putting off a backlog of maintenance that is about an investment of $2 trillion, which makes me think to myself, how can a great country like ours continue to be great when we are unwilling to make the kind of investment that will make us so? So, Mr. Kismet, in your expert opinion, do you feel like the United States has kept in, Mr. Tomer? Do you think that the United States has kept in pace with other developed nations when it comes to this investment stream?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Representative Omar. And I'm glad you asked, because also to correct the record from Congressman Siri's comment in my direction, I do believe we need to spend more. I do not believe we are keeping up with our developed and frankly even developing or emerging economy peers as well. The challenge there is making sure we understand exactly what we want to invest in. So just a very quick metaphor for anyone who either rents an apartment or owns a home, right, of any size, you could infinitely invest in that property, whether it's art on the walls, changing out your roof, expansions, what have you. We have to make difficult decisions. So the question is, yes, we clearly need to spend more. We know about the failing grades. We know about water infrastructure that's not working, a lack of broadband infrastructure in rural and urban neighborhoods. The question is, how do we pick what we invest in? Mm-hmm. How do we have vertical collaboration, federal, state, local? And what's the role of the private sector to work alongside the public sector? So yes, to invest more, the question is doing it wisely.
Yeah, and furthermore, how is this country's global competitiveness and long-term growth potential impacted by the backlog we currently have in maintaining the needs of the aging infrastructure networks?
Yeah, thank you again, Representative. The world is rapidly digitalizing everywhere. Emerging economies are banking via mobile phones, right? And digitally banked at that. Meanwhile, the scooters that many of us see in our communities, including right here in Washington, you need a digital bank account to be able to use those. You need a smartphone. You need to know how to use a smartphone. And I'm not trying to pick on any employer. In fact, I think this is a good thing, by the way. To apply for a job at McDonald's, you often need to have a digital resume. You have an email address. You need to have a way to be able to submit that resume and then check your email to see, right, what the response is. We are woefully behind on the levels of digitalization we should have, which when we are truly still either number one or number two, depending on the data, the wealthiest country in aggregate in the world. So we need a stronger case to digitalize everyone. And that's probably one of the most glaring elements I see in terms of economic competitiveness. Many of our regions and households who live in them and businesses are fully digitalized, but there's still so much more ground to go.
Do any of you have anything to add?
May I comment, Madam? Yeah, I think it's a wonderful question. Well, one thing I really think we should stress in terms of spending is, again, what we spend it on. And we have been blessed in this country to have a mature transportation system for decades that gives us unprecedented connectivity. China, of course, is still building it out, right? But what we face is a problem with operation and maintenance, and that gets back to Mr. Johnson's point. The spending really needs to address this deferred maintenance problem that we have in the United States. We don't need to build another interstate highway system. We need to take care of the one that we have. And I think we need to think carefully about how we can create policies. That's why I've stressed public-private partnerships that include operation and maintenance in the contract. And spending more money on that operation and maintenance to improve those ASCE grades, I think, is the focus.
Yeah, and deferred maintenance sometimes can be very costly. There was a highway that went down in my home state, Highway 35, and not only were lives lost, but it cost us greatly economically to be able to rebuild that. Investing in 21st century infrastructure is critically important. It's one thing that I've been talking about, and the investment and expansion of our broadband should be a priority for all of us. So thank you all for being here and speaking on that. I yield back.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Burchett, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member. The Highway Trust Fund, I feel like, is in terrible shape. And as a nation, we need to be looking into new ways to fund our nation's infrastructure. And I apologize, I walked out. This might have been asked 1,000 times. And if it is, this is 1,001. But I'd really like to hear what y'all have to say. You know, however, with the rise of these electric vehicles, which I kind of get a little tickled when somebody says I'm saving the environment, I'm riding a bus, or I'm riding an electric vehicle in Tennessee. You know, it's usually one of those coal-fired plants that it puts that electricity out. So, although our coal-fired plants are doing a lot better than they used to. Of course, with the rise of these electric vehicles and their growing in efficiency in the automobile industry, I feel like it's time to start looking into a new source of funding. Dr. Gaddis, what would be your recommendation for financing our country's infrastructure?
So thank you, Congressman. That's one of the big reasons I made a distinction between funding and financing in my testimony, is that the underlying problem is really funding, which you point to.
And you can just call me Tim. When they say Congressman up here, I usually just keep walking because I know they're talking to one of these old guys back here. So.
Call me Rick.
All right, Rick.
But that's why I'm like a broken record. I say VMT fees. Because if you drive an electric vehicle...
Now, I know what VMT stands for, but Dan Crenshaw beside me doesn't, so why don't you tell me what...
For Dan's benefit?
Yes, sir, for Dan's benefit.
It's a vehicle miles traveled fee. And it's just a per mile fee, and it's the same way we charge for electricity or natural gas, per therm or per gallon of water, right? You just charge per mile of road use.
Now I'm a gearhead. So what are you going to do? You going to put it on the odometer? Is it going to be another one of these electronic devices that y'all want to put on something that a lot of the folks in East Tennessee are a little leery of?
Yeah, I've got you. So this is why the state of Oregon is a state we always look to, because they've been 3 pilot projects over a decade to address exactly those questions. How do you do it? There's different ways that sort of dial in the level of privacy you can have. One, I call it the all-you-can-eat version of using the roads. You pay, I think, a quarterly fee, and they don't monitor anything. They don't monitor your odometer. They don't monitor your location. There's another one that's a little box about this big that all cars have a USB port now that monitors your car's speedometer.
All your cars do, not all of mine.
Not in Tennessee.
I got a 61 International Scout and a 69.
No, I
BMW.
drive an old Chevy, just for the record. But the little box on a new car would monitor the speedometer. If you know what the speedometer of a car is doing, you know how many miles it's traveled. The privacy is perfectly protected. For maybe younger people who don't seem to care about privacy at all, you can use a gizmo like this, and it gets down to the sub-meter level where your car is, and you can charge based on those movements. And that's, that's maybe the lowest cost per mile, but it's the least private in some sense. So really states, and California is looking very serious at this. Minnesota's looking very seriously at this road usage charge or vehicle miles traveled. What it does, it divorces the use of the road from the fuel the vehicle uses. So you can have an electric vehicle, but everybody uses the same lane mile. You charge for the lane mile rather than the fuel use. And that's why so many policy wonks like me like it.
I say a lot of, me included, are going to have, folks like me are going to have to die off before we actually buy into that, because that's I can see a lot of pitfalls with that, especially some of my conservative folks. Of course, we're constantly having to prop up the Highway Trust Fund with other accounts, and I'd like to know, start with you, sir, and just real quick before I run out of time, how do y'all suggest that we get our spending under control?
You want to go ahead? No.
Thanks for punting that to me. I believe firmly in setting up these outcomes that we care about, and understanding the revenue streams that are coming in, as well as exactly what you all were just exchanging about. What are those future revenue sources? Relative to other accounts across the federal government, the Highway Trust Fund actually has much more concrete set of barriers. Let's to mix metaphors a bit.
Right. In Tennessee, we manage our money very well. Our legislature balanced budget and things like that. But one thing we didn't do when they put the gas tax in, they didn't put a multiplier in. Now they've had to go back and bump it up again, and I worry about that. Of course, you can't take into account electric vehicles and things like that. Any of y'all, ma'am? Okay, that's fine. We're good.
Well, I will say that it is about spending, but it's about how we spend and what we're spending it on. And because we are not spending it on the operations and maintenance, we're spending a lot more in the replacement and repair down the road. And so if we were making those investments along the way to make sure that the infrastructure we built was staying in the best state of repair, if you don't change your oil, eventually your engine's going to need a lot more work than if you just did that routine maintenance along the way. So how do we control it? We do that routine, annual, planned, and needs to be budgeted over years and decades, funding to support the operations and maintenance.
Everybody? Well, I don't yield back any of my time, Mr. Chairman.
No,
I
the gentleman's
apologize
time
for
has
it. Thank
expired.
you for your indulgence, and thank all y'all. This has probably been one of the more informative committees, and this has been one of the more informative meetings in that committee. So thank y'all.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Woodall, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. I appreciated, Ms. Haddock, when you said federal funds should be used to leverage, not replace state and local funds. When we talk about operations and maintenance in particular, though, if I'm going to leverage state and local funds, and those states and localities plead poverty because they have a lot of other things they're also working on, I'm not casting aspersions on their motives, just the fact that they don't budget for it, then what? Do I go ahead and pay 100% of the cost with federal dollars, or do I allow those assets to fall into disrepair facing the larger outlays in the future that you described?
So the best way to tackle these moving forward is to make sure that up front we have the agreements. One of the things that in Houston that voters have supported and have been willing to do is to not only have fees, but to raise fees when they are dedicated to the purpose for which they're set up for. Back in 2010 and reaffirmed this past year, our voters actually dedicated a drainage fee specifically to deal with stormwater in the city of Houston. And that money is used for improvements in the infrastructure. So it has to be a partnership, and it has to be that agreement up front where we as local entities, when we sign on to these things, that we have it dedicated in a way that we cannot override, that we have it in the agreements, and that we have it in the legislation, we have it in the agreements moving forward to make sure that doesn't happen. There are competitions. We have people that are trying to figure out how to get from paycheck to paycheck to do the things that they need to do.
And that's in a community where the only thing you have more of than water is tax revenues, right? I mean, Houston's on fire economically in ways that a lot of the rest of the country hopes to achieve. Mr. Coase, you said, which I appreciated, it's not how we invest is more important than how much we invest, though I know how much is important also. Are there circumstances in aging infrastructure, whether it's in rural America or whether it's in urban America, where retrofitting is more expensive than starting all over again? Or is it universally true that repairing that wastewater facility that hasn't been maintained in 50 years is superior to building a new community right next door?
I would say, based on our research, traditionally, physically, from a physical responsibility standpoint, investing in existing communities is cheaper than building new communities. Generally, in my hometown of Thomasville, Georgia, we had to do that same dilemma. Do we invest in our downtown, which needed new stormwater system, new sewers, because we want to provide more housing, or do we build more suburban development out closer to 319 towards Tallahassee? We did a both-and approach, but one of the things we did do in that situation is that we actually forced the developer not to actually just invest in the short-term investment of the project, but actually dedicate revenues for long-term to actually take the cost of that future infrastructure off the city rolls. And I think, unfortunately, for too often, the federal government and state governments have not allowed and created that level of framework or partnership to ensure that we are actually capturing the full cost of these infrastructure costs.
I think about all of our conversations in suburban America. I represent suburban Atlanta about mass transit, and I think about what Dallas did, right? You build a brand new line out there, and then you build a brand new community on what was a cornfield yesterday, and now you've built the infrastructure. And real estate professionals are finding it effective to break new ground instead of rehab old ground.
And largely because, unfortunately, this country has a diversity ecosystem of communities that have been dedicating, who have the existing assets, but there's a pent-up demand for walkable urban development. And developers are now finding, whether it's in South Florida, in California, and also in Dallas, where we will take the lead. If the federal government won't, or the state and local government won't take the lead, we would do it. But unfortunately, that also comes with certain consequences, because we'll go to locations that have the least resistance. And this is why I made the point earlier. This is not just a conversation about the federal government spending more money on infrastructure. If the local governments and state governments are not ensuring that local land use decisions, their local economic development decisions are ensuring that those initial federal assets are being leveraged to the highest cost, you will have more examples of bad infrastructure not meeting the economic returns that we need.
I read Mr. Tamer's testimony and Dr. Geddes' testimony, and yes, if we can get Brookings and AEI on the same page, you'd think we'd be able to get some work done around here. But the Hoover Dam example we heard earlier is absolutely true. We need to demonstrate to taxpayers they're going to get a rate of return on their investment. And yes, if they get $1 worth of value out of $1 worth of new taxes, I agree with Mr. Peters. It's shameful that we're deficit financing Transportation Trust Fund. That was the lone user fee we had left that was working in this country. If we're going to spend more, we've got to raise more. But I can't promise $1 worth of value when building a state road takes about 3.5 years less permitting-wise than building a federal road. I asked the two of you gentlemen, as my time expires, we can get on the same page about deficit financing, we can get on the same page about prioritizing. Can we get on the same page that whether we solve it a little or solve it a lot, that we've got to deliver projects faster because time is money?
Yes, yes, Congressman. So the one federal decision, I think, is a terrific step in the right direction where you get the permitting. So as I noted in my written testimony, a number of agencies have to weigh in, getting a number of permits, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, et cetera, to get a big project permitted. But the process can continue concurrently, so the agencies are sort of working together through one lead agency. So the key is there's a lead agency, and that agency sort of has responsibility to shepherd it through the process, and I think at some point make a decision for the other agencies if they're dragging their feet. So either permit the project or don't. And have a target. I've talked to people in my world, they think this target of 2 years, is just having the target is a really good thing. Of course, there's other issues, but I think that is a very good step in the right direction. And I would urge Congress to think carefully about, I guess, extending that. I think the Senate has done something on that, and codifying that in the next reauthorization bill. It's deplorable, really, how slow the United States is to get big, important projects delivered, even small projects.
Thank you for your indulgence, Mr. Chairman.
Absolutely. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Norman, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I want to thank each one of our people at the table. Let me just reemphasize what Mr. Roy and Ms. Smith said. To not have a budget is inexcusable. For us to be sitting here with flying blind, you wouldn't do it in your business, you wouldn't do it in any family budget, but that's a different discussion for a different day at a different time. Now, infrastructure. How would we, everybody, Democrat, Republican, will agree infrastructure is important. The question is, how do you prioritize it? Is it broadband? Is it roads? Is it bridges? I was with a bridge manufacturer who makes the equipment that goes under bridges, that instructs the pilings and the and he made something that was pretty startling. He said, what it's going to take, Congressman, is a couple of bridges collapsing, which is going to happen, and then maybe you will prioritize. So help from each one of you are educated, you in different fields. From prioritization, I get that it's our responsibility, but from prioritization, how would you rank each individual thing, and where do we spend the money? We have more needs. We got a lot of wants, but we've got a lot of needs. How would you, and from where you sit, prioritize where we put the money? And God help us if we find out where to pay for it, but where would you put the money?
I think it was punted to me first. As a civil engineer, we're always going to lean on life safety first. Water, wastewater, transportation, flooding. Those. I mean, they're almost all equal. But I will say that water and wastewater are critical, not just to the service that we provide people on a daily basis, but to the national health. Then when you layer in transportation and stormwater on top of that, that's when you begin to get to the national economy. Our commerce relies on that reliable, sustainable infrastructure. And you can't ignore broadband, communication, all those things, because currently our commerce depends on all those things. You can't rent a scooter without the cell phone. Well, that's a simple local example. But the truth of the matter is that even our interstate freight movement, whether it's rail, whether it's inland waterways, whether it's freight on wheels, the communication system that makes all that happen across it is important. So when you ask me to prioritize, what I would say is that we need to generate funding sources tied to each of the uses that are tied back to the user fees. And so it is not necessarily that we compete one against each other. It's that we marry them up with the appropriate funding sources to make sure that they are all funded and that they are all able to move forward.
Yeah, I'll add one. That was great. I'll add on top of that. Because so much, and I mean this in a lowercase u way, there's so many utilities in the infrastructure sector, and that's a big reason we want the VMT fees. It provides that kind of utility pricing to transportation. We have natural dynamics to kind of get those user fees aligned. One of the major challenges we have in the country, and what motivated my comments today, is there are what economists would say uninternalized costs, right? Negative externalities, positive externalities. That's part of the reason we have, and this body is so perfect for that, right? Is to come together and figure out, well, what are our shared priorities, right? What does it mean to have affordability for everyone in any district, right? To get to work no matter how long the drive might be, right? What is that worth it to us? We have to start putting a price on that on top of the actual infrastructure itself. Combined, that's how you get to the right kind of model of how we then prioritize what we need. We can bring some financial accountability here, but it's powered by actually our shared values, right, and what matters to us.
Congressman, can I add? footnote to your footnote. So this is one, I wrote a little book on public-private partnerships because I believe in this approach, and other countries are using it. One of the strongest reasons to use public-private partnerships is you get signals from the private sector about project priorities. In other words, if you bid out a project and the private sector won't touch it, maybe that's telling you something about the viability of that project. There's reasons to subsidize projects, right, that don't generate enough money from user fees, but it's the issue of project selection, Congressman, and the private sector involvement through a PPP structure, which is wrapping these different elements of project delivery together in a big contract, really helps with the project selection issue. So that's just my footnote.
Thank each one of you, and I appreciate your participation. I yield back.
That gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that you are holding this hearing, and obviously thank you to the ranking member as well as all the witnesses who are here and your preparation to be here, and obviously your work that you have done in order to get to this position. So thank you very much. I represent the Central Coast of California, and obviously what I hear from my constituents is infrastructure is needed in that area on a number of projects. Right now, we are working on one that deals with a floodplain and dealing with the place called the Pajaro River and the Pajaro River floodplain that it affects. Now, obviously, Ms. Haddock, if I may address some of my questions to you, I know you're critically aware of the importance of the Army Corps of Engineers and their work on these types of flood control projects. But I'm sure you're also aware that there is a substantial backlog in Corps projects, which does tend to disproportionately impact areas like the areas that surround the Pajaro that are of low socioeconomic backgrounds in those areas. And so I was wondering, Ms. Haddock, did you do work with completing flood control projects that affected low-income communities in Houston?
So prior to joining the City of Houston, I did work with the Harris County Flood Control District, and we did partnered projects with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers throughout the city.
Exactly.
I will say that the current, at the time, which was in the 90s into the early 2000s, and also even through today, that the processes and equations that were required to follow to demonstrate a project be implemented or not do depend largely on the value of what's being protected.
Yeah.
And when you do that, it does result in low income and lower valued properties being further down the list.
Understood. And based on those many hurdles that are constantly and consistently put up by a number of agencies, do you have any best practices you can share with us in order to get over those hurdles, especially to protect low-income areas like that?
So I will say that first off, I do believe that it is necessary to have a cost-benefit analysis when you look at it, because we have to determine that it's a good investment to begin with.
Understood.
But some of the things that we've done in Houston is take the value of the land out of the equation and convert it to the number of people that are protected versus the value of the things that are protected. When we're looking at transportation projects, we look at a car equals a bus boarding. When we are looking at replacing a roadway, we're changing the framework that we look at the benefit in the project to not just be directly tied to pure economics, to allow us to have more flexible ways to prioritize where is the best investment in that. The other thing is that we have to look very closely at the community itself. The land may be cheaper, but the impact to the community may be greater whenever you bring in larger infrastructure in those areas. And so we have to work very carefully to balance those as we look to implement projects.
Let me ask you something. Obviously, in my area, as you know, which can be known as the salad bowl of the world or the berry bowl of the world, depending on what specialty crop you grow. But obviously, what about taking into account certain agriculture and certain agriculture lands that are around these projects as well? Would that be a recommendation of yours as well?
Well, I believe that we need to look at every part of our economy that supports the nation, and so agriculture and the ability to provide in the food supply is important at home.
Yeah. And now, look, I mean, obviously, in dealing with the Army Corps, as good a work they do, kind of as you alluded to, they can be difficult, and sometimes they can just say no. That being said, if the Corps is unable to fund a project, let's say in these types of communities, do you have any recommendation as to where we can turn for funding for assistance with flood mitigation? And I would open this up to the board.
So I would start off by saying that mitigation has been shown that for every dollar you spend in mitigation, you save $6 in future disaster recovery. That's right. And so it is really important that we recognize that investment in mitigation is not just about that upfront equation. That investment in mitigation is about long-term benefit to our budgets and our spending down the road. But it's not just about the money either. It's also about the emotional, the toil on people as they go through disasters. In Houston, we're wary of flooding. And to have that repair money come to put us back in the same place where we were before the flood is not necessarily the appropriate place to be spending the money. We need to invest this recovery money to be more resilient and more sustainable as we move forward, so that next time we're not having to respond in the same way. How do you do that up front in a project is one of the things that we face on a daily basis as we look to implement projects. You really have to have, as my colleagues down here have said, you have to have a plan for where you're going, and then you have to make sure each dollar you invest and each project you implement is working you towards that plan.
Understood. Thank you for your work, and I look forward to working with the Army Corps of Engineers with that advice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Crenshaw, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here today on what is a pretty productive discussion, and especially to a constituent of mine, Ms. Carol Haddock, who came up from Houston for this hearing. As Carol is, of course, aware, we have a flooding problem in Houston. In fact, I just got back from my district where we had horrible flooding for the second time that I've been in Congress, which has not been very long. It's actually part of the reason I got into politics. Hurricane Harvey landed a sucker punch to Houston. One part of my district, Kingwood, it's at the bottom of a 2,500 square mile funnel where all of the watersheds empty into. It creates a problem. How do you prevent flooding in a place like that? It's a bit of creative engineering, but a lot of local permitting, county drainage decisions, channel dredging, and dam maintenance, all of which are important parts of that equation. So to Houston, federal support has been a blessing and sometimes a curse. We've received plenty of funding, but sometimes that funding is so delayed, like the $4 billion in HUD funding, or so weighted down with red tape that funds become inoperable. So my question for Ms. Haddock, outside of the funding itself, what are your key concerns on being able to deliver improvements in flood mitigation for the city of Houston?
Thank you for that question. That is something we could probably talk about for hours. But the struggle that we have in Houston is a combination of deferred maintenance, existing infrastructure that was not ever envisioned for the type of activities that we're asking it to perform today. The lake that overflowed, that Kingwood was flooded by, was designed to be a water supply lake without gates or releases for flood control. It was designed for one purpose. It was built for one purpose, and that was not an Army Corps of Engineers design. It was actually, the city of Houston was largely involved in that. But it's one of those things that it's not just the money that's coming today, it's the infrastructure that's in place today that we're having to evaluate and look at. A lot of times when funding comes to us, the public gets very frustrated that it's not being spent faster. But infrastructure projects take years. If we have a plan in place and we know where we're going to go, it still can take a year or two to design that infrastructure before we can construct it. And as you said this morning, or just now, that less than 2 years, we've had another event in Houston.
And this gets to something else I said about the red tape surrounding that federal funding. Can you speak really briefly to that and how that affects the local level engineers actually receiving that funding?
So my experience, and I've been in the flood control arena most of my career, has been that the funding that you see from a major flooding event, that the first infrastructure funding you see is 5 to 10 years after the event. That's the first time that it's available for you to put projects in the ground. We have projects in the ground in Houston that were from Tropical Storm Allison in 2001 that were in place just before Hurricane Ike in 2008. And we're still working with 2015, 2016. How can we speed that up? I would say in communities that are capable of dealing with a direct allocation, that if we can directly allocate that funding to the local communities, that they can implement it
If
quickly.
you have a partner like Harris County Flood Control District, that's trustworthy. I want to shift gears, because we have very little time, to the Houston Ship Channel. Can you talk briefly about the impact of the current proposed widening of the ship channel and the impact, the economic impact, engineering impact that would have on Houston?
Not just Houston, on a large portion of the country and the world, absolutely. The Houston Ship Channel is one of the largest ports in the country, bringing in foreign and domestic tonnage and dividing that up and spreading it throughout the country, whether it's through rail or wheels or other ways that it distributes out of that. And so having the Houston Ship Channel widened and deepened to be ready to accept the new larger ships that are available to access the new Panama Canal is not only essential for Houston and Texas, it's actually essential for the United States.
And I'll end with a discussion on traffic. Houston, like many big cities, has a real problem with traffic. We could build more highways. We can't build more highways, right? There's no more space for it. Going underground doesn't seem logical either. What is the city of Houston doing? Are there any innovative ideas coming up on the issue of reducing traffic congestion?
So some of the discussions that we're having, not necessarily on the highways, but on the streets in the city of Houston, is that if we're going to widen a roadway, that any additional lanes that would be added would be dedicated solely to high occupancy and transit, that we would not add lanes for single occupancy vehicle cars. We've also got a robust off-road network of bikeways being built, but that's going to be years before that's built out to a point that it's safe for people to commute long distances. You can commute 5 to 10 miles easily today. But we need to look at other ways to add capacity that don't involve us sitting individually in our individual cars driving to our locations. We need to look at alternate ways to bring that additional capacity into our system.
Thank you. I'm out of time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Nevada, Mr. Horsford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I've been hearing from my constituents in Nevada that we simply cannot continue to wait until it's too late and too costly for us to fix our crumbling infrastructure. Since 2010, Nevada's total population has grown by nearly 300,000 new residents, making Nevada the 6th fastest growing state in the country. And as our state grows, so does our need to expand our transportation and infrastructure needs. While our roads and bridges need desperate attention, we must also consider our community's broader infrastructure challenges, everything from dams to modernizing our schools. For example, the American Society of Civil Engineers gave Nevada a D rating on our dam system. Additionally, of the 17 school districts throughout Nevada, they all require some level of modernization in our facilities to help prepare students for high-tech careers in the future. I recently met with a group of constituents from White Pine Main Street Association in the rural part of my district in northern Nevada. And in that meeting, they shared with me the need to update their storm drainage system and the fiber optic lines at the Ely Roadway Rehabilitation Project. It's a project that's now on hold because of lack of federal funding. So these are examples of what happens when federal investment isn't available. Nevada's infrastructure is not being met, and it's unacceptable. So, Mr. Tomer, you've been involved in efforts to make infrastructure a component of regional planning and economic development. That's most effectively done at the local level, as each community's circumstances and needs will be different, like the ones in White Pine County. Are there things that we can and should do at the federal level to help communities and their development efforts?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Congressman. one of the hardest issues we face in the country, and I apologize if this doesn't apply directly to the to your rural constituents that you mentioned, but is a tremendous amount of jurisdictional fragmentation. We colloquially use the term city, right? Las Vegas, just I'm saying, is the largest metropolitan area, and Nevada is a perfect example of this, right? Las Vegas, we say it casually, but when you go to the strip hotels, you're not in actually Las Vegas, right?
County.
Right. So this level of fragmentation causes immense amount of challenges, not just on the transportation front, but also the water and even sometimes telecom. And the answers here are complicated, but there's no question that our original founding documents were not intended, I think in my mind, of like a place like Boston, right? You know, where they weren't imagined to extend beyond those municipal borders. So the question is, how can the federal government serve as a jumping off point for regional conversations around, and again, I'm not touching schools or other elements that are more complicated, frankly, but transportation systems are inherently regional assets, as are water and other essential infrastructure. How can we provide a platform for our regional governance to be more aligned with the way we casually term out city names the same way?
Thank you. Nevada also has over 32,000 miles of roadways that require attention. More than 500 bridges in Nevada are over 50 years old and will require approximately $133 million for repairs. To address congestion in the region, the Interstate 11 plan, which would connect Phoenix and Las Vegas, the two metropolitan communities in the United States that currently do not have an interstate, would be developed. And I'm proud to have worked on that both at the state level when I was in the state Senate, and we've made advancements here. But just a couple of weeks ago, I had over 150 business people here from the Metro Chamber of Commerce who came to DC to remind Congress and the administration that this is an important infrastructure project that will enhance the economies of the communities along its route, create opportunities for economic development and job creation, and better connect businesses to those new markets. So what could we be doing for projects like this as we reauthorize the Highway Trust Bill, but also making sure that we have investment for these major types of projects like Interstate 11? Ms. Haddock, could you speak to that?
So you asked a very wide-based question there. Challenge me on that. What I will say is that as we're looking at this infrastructure investment, that new infrastructure and renewal of existing infrastructure definitely have to be balanced as we're looking at that, creating those new opportunities for connectivity, creating those new areas where we don't currently have that connectivity is absolutely important. It goes back to the comment earlier. We have to know where we're going. That wasn't part of the plan. You've made it part of the plan. And now we have to invest in that and continue to move those things forward. But we also have to be willing to invest in the operations and maintenance beyond the initial construction if we're going to continue to improve our infrastructure throughout this country.
Thank you so much. I know my time has expired. It's a very important issue, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to working with you under your leadership to advance these priorities.
Gentleman's time has expired. Now recognize the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member, let me thank you so very much for this particular hearing. Just about 5 days ago, City of Houston experienced what I know many of our citizens, Harris County and in the surrounding counties, feared that they might be facing Hurricane Harvey again. The reason, of course, is because of our particular topography. Certainly members of Congress tried to make their way home as quickly as possible, but as I was getting reports, I was seeing the fear in my constituents in particular, because Imelda would come, it started, and then it started and stopped and started again. And I think the greatest damage was done in the subsequent downpour that I'm told by my local officials, some 43 inches, were scattered throughout the region, and I know there is still standing water. We live every day the crucialness of the need, in spite of our outstanding residents that include Carol, if I may call her a dear friend, thank her for her leadership along with all the other witnesses. But we live in a state of crisis in jurisdictions and topographies like Florida along the southeast coast. As Dorian made her way up, I had just spoken to the leadership in the Bahamas. They are still suffering. So I think that we need to really pull up our pants legs, if you will, and pull up the pants and really get back to the business of investing in infrastructure. And I know that we have a sincere problem because in the 19th century as we move forward into the 20th century, 19th century was in the early stages of the railroad, but in the 20th century, we can find that we did more investment in infrastructure than we've been able to document in the 21st century. Certainly the 21st century sounds like a modern terminology, but here we are talking about the gaps in funding. So I want to pose some questions. First of all, go directly through to the point of concern, and that is the decline in federal, state, and local investment in infrastructure over the last few decades. If you would share what you think the reason is for that, and in your pithy answer, because I have a follow-up and it seems the clock is ticking. Carol, why don't we start with you? You know, are there structural issues such as project selection practices, processes, overlapping jurisdictions with the federal government? What do we think has contributed to that trend because the overall population of the United States is being impacted negatively?
So I'll start by saying is that many of the fees that are generated, and in many cases the property taxes that back the investment in our infrastructure have been relatively flat. I mean, we've talked about the gas tax not being indexed and hasn't been raised since 1993. If you adjust that for inflation, we see a 40% reduction in actual buying power. So a lot of that reduction in investment has been directly attributable to the revenues and the funding going into it not growing with the costs of infrastructure investment. So that's been it on some cases. You asked about the problems of overlapping jurisdictions between state, federal, and local. I would say even within local. The comment earlier about Nevada. You know, in Houston, you know that we have over 27 different cities just in Harris County that are overlapping those jurisdictions, and so we're all working within that. We're all working within the fees that we have available to us. The state of Texas has made more money available recently. That's a little bit different than some of the trends that we're seeing nationwide, but that is still not addressing the fact
my time is going. So let me thank you for a very thorough answer. Let me ask Mr. Coase, and let me see if you can also, Mr. Tomer, fit in. First of all, there should be smart infrastructure, and it should be environmentally responsive to the needs of those communities. Would you respond to that? And let me put on your mind, we have a project in Texas, I-45. It is important, but it is abusive to minority and impoverished communities. I'm fighting it. I want it to be an effective infrastructure project, but I want it to embrace the neighborhoods. Would you respond to how those can match together, if you would?
If we're, thank you for that, Congresswoman. If we're honest, the legacy of U.S. infrastructure spending has been tied to race. And we are literally digging ourselves out of that ugly legacy. And we cannot afford to not retrofit these neighborhoods that have been either disconnected from opportunity through roads or through even rail infrastructure. And one of the biggest challenges, and to my comments earlier, is that federal investment has to be a leader because it was federal investment that started.
Yeah, I will just say very quickly, you know, Houston has a massive measure coming up in November to invest in itself. The ballot measures around transportation and also economic development pass at basically a 3/4 rate across the country, and it's really effectively higher than that because often when you lose, you come back with a better one and they win. That kind of gets back to our shared point here of locally, you know what you're getting. You know how you're investing in your future. That's the same call we have here to Congress, right? Outline what our future growth patterns is and how you can build that partnerships with state and local.
I love it. Mr. Chairman, you've been very kind and ranking member, and all I would say is that this is our business and we need to get engaged in this business to help our local leaders here, but also to help the American people. I yield back. Thank you.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Now I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Khanna.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your leadership in convening this hearing to highlight the importance of infrastructure. I was encouraged by the comments of Representative Johnson, who brought up rural broadband and the need for an investment in rural broadband in this country. China is spending $22 billion to hook up 98% of its country on high-speed internet. And the estimates I've seen is $40 billion would get high-speed internet access, affordable high-speed internet access to every American. Is there any reason that we shouldn't just do this as a nation to be competitive in the 21st century on a bipartisan basis? Mr. Tomer, since you're nodding, maybe we can start with you and then have everyone else chime in.
The dangers of body language. Does not that Chinese example you cited sound like investment in the future to everyone in this room today? That's what we're looking for in infrastructure. There is absolutely a massively impactful consensus to be built in both chambers of Congress across both partisan lines on how this can benefit. It's a rural challenge, it's an urban challenge, right? Even in Silicon Valley, there are those who live without broadband. And for those of us who are parents in the room, we know how much our classrooms are digitalizing. What happens to those students who go home, even if they have digital access in their schools, again, whether in a rural or urban classroom, and they can't connect to the internet? We are putting ourselves at a structurally speaking economic disadvantage in the future, because those are our future workers, those are our future entrepreneurs. So absolutely, I hope we can make this investment.
Anyone else want to comment? Dr. Geddes?
If I may, yes. Thanks, Congressman. I would like to comment. I totally agree, and it's interesting to look at the way China's doing that. You know, and the question for all of this is how do you pay for it? Right? It's all about funding. Delivery PPPs are important, but it's all about the underlying money. One of the things, policy issues I'd like to get on the table is the notion of tax increment financing, which is a technique the Chinese have used in some ways. Other communities, places in Boston are using it. And it's the idea that the infrastructure increases the value of the property that the infrastructure is installed in, and you capture some of the increased value through a tax that you know, it's a portion of that, and you bond against the increased tax revenue to install the infrastructure to begin with. Basically moving that value that the infrastructure creates in the future into the present, bond against it to install the infrastructure. It works. So I'd urge Congress to think about, to look at what other countries are doing, look at what some cities in the United States are doing, expand on that, encourage other localities to do it, because it really is all about the funding.
Thank you, Dr. Geddes. My final question is about economic growth. The president, I disagree with a lot of things. One thing he does is market 4% economic growth. He sold his tax plan as. Now we're at not even, we're barely at 2% economic growth, but no one is asking what happened to the 4% that we were promised. The reality is the American Society of Civil Engineers, as Ms. Ellinger knows, has projected that a $2 trillion infrastructure budget would create 5% economic growth. 5%. Starting with you, Ms. Ellinger, my question is, do you believe an infrastructure investment would actually achieve more economic growth than the president's tax cuts and the president's tax policy?
So I'm going to dance around that question a little bit. What I do know is that investment in infrastructure will have a direct positive impact to the economy, short-term and long-term, through the jobs that are created through design and construction, but more importantly, through the 75% of the overall cost of infrastructure that go into long-term operations and maintenance jobs. It is direct, it is tangible, and it is long-lasting. So ASCE absolutely believes and supports that investment in infrastructure is investment in this country.
Mr. Coase?
I would say that while I agree with my colleague, there is a such thing as bad infrastructure investments, and that if we were to continue to do the same thing we've been doing for the last 20 years, we will stay where we are, which is at 2% growth.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'm happy to say on the record, a tax cut can be absolutely supercharging for growth. That tax cut was not structured for long-term growth, and we saw that due to corporate stock buybacks as option, example number one. So, cutting taxes can absolutely be something on the table. And exactly to Christopher's point, making sure that we structure infrastructure investment can lead to long-run returns, but we need to make sure that we're designing those effectively as well.
If I may, Congressman, so I want to echo the point that it is possible to have bad infrastructure investment. It's how do you invest? And some projects can be enormously socially valuable and others not so, which is why we advocate rigorous benefit cost analysis for all the projects. So targeting is key.
Gentleman's time has expired. I now yield 10 minutes to the ranking member, Mr. Womack.
All right, thank you very much, and a very enlightening panel today. First of all, I wish my friends on the other side would just quit demonizing the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. It creates millions of jobs. It has raised wages in a lot of areas. It has created lots of opportunity for people that needed that opportunity, and I just don't think it should be the piñata that it has become because it's an easily attacked sort of program. And I don't necessarily believe that the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act by itself is what our economy needs. It needs a lot of things, and we've done a lot of those things. I think tax cuts are important, but I also think reg reform is important, and we've done a lot of reg reform, which I think helps stimulate the economy. But I'm not going to get too far down that road because I got some other things I want to look at. But on the subject of taxes, I mean, we've all pretty much said that we've got to, even though I think you, Mr. Tomer, said not just throw more money at the problem, but in everything that we're talking about today, we need to throw more money at the problem. And we know that the Highway Trust Fund is part of the issue. 1993, last time it was raised, not indexed for inflation, buying power of that kind of money, and we've got cars getting better mileage. But here we are advocating now, doing something with a Highway Trust Fund, which is going to be a tax increase on the lower and middle class, disproportionate to the high income people. As said earlier, somebody has a Tesla, they don't really pay it. But somebody that drives I think somebody said a Ford F-150. I'm not picking
old Ford F-150.
An old one.
Yeah.
Pays disproportionately more for those increases. So I don't know where that sweet spot's going to be. But I would like to just kind of throw a question out for the panel. You graded the infrastructure at a D+. I think that's how you characterize it. Don't let me put words in your mouth. Can you grade America on its ability to plan for the future? And so as a backdrop to my question, let me just tell you, when I was a mayor for 12 years, I operated under a philosophy with all of my staff that we were going to do things based on what we called the mayor after next philosophy, that we were going to build things where we could today, not to benefit the near term, but to serve the interest for a generation from now. How are we doing in America on planning for the future? Maybe the generation after next.
The generation after next. So you started your question with, do we have the ability? And the answer is absolutely, I believe we have the ability. The question is, do we have the courage? We have not planned for the generation after next today. And I do believe that our predecessors did, and that much of the infrastructure that's wearing out today is infrastructure that was planned for the generation after next. And so your question for me is really one of that all of us have responsibility in addressing. Part of it is we have to have a consistent, reliable, and dependable source of funds so that we can plan for the future. That involves all of us, that involves federal, state, local, private, and that it's beyond a year or two, that it's beyond even 5 years. Planning in my world is 50 to 100 years. We're planning water supplies, we're planning water infrastructure for 100 years from now. But the one thing that we also have to consider when we're planning is we don't know what the next change in technology or the next change in things that are coming down the road. If we planned for transportation based on 1950s vehicles, we would not be building the right infrastructure today for the generation.
Can I throw a
next.
prospect at you in
Absolutely.
terms of looking down the road? This is hard for people to imagine. What about vertical takeoff? In terms of mobility, people moving around. We're about to see, in fact, we're seeing it today, where drones are delivering someone's prescription or package that they bought online. What about the ability to move people? Are we thinking long-term about those kinds of things? That's generation after next kind of stuff.
So I will take a point of personal privilege and say that the American Society of Civil Engineers is asking ourselves those questions right now. We've invested financially and we've invested our personnel resources in developing a future world vision, one that is a virtual world based on real world data, on real projections forward as to what a future world might look like. And we've looked at one that is an island dealing with water. We're building those out as we go. We'll be rolling the first one out this fall on what it looks like to live with and in water.
Well, I know this, that it is important that we deal with today. I also think we've got to spend a little time in thought, looking out to the future as to what the long-term needs are going to be. But we do have the today needs, and that's where we're back to. So I want to bring us back to the present. What is the right mix of federal and state and local P3 involvement in terms of the mix of leveraging precious resources? And I'm going to come back to resources here in a minute. But what is that right mix? Should we have formula dollars set aside so that the whole country benefits, or with a slice off for competitive stuff, so that if a local community wanted to put more skin in the game, then they would score, if you will, and qualify?
At Smart Growth America, through our Transportation for America campaign, we believe that you should have a mixture, but we should have key priorities for each of those buckets. For example, the formula dollars, we believe, should be dedicated for repair. After you have reached a certain level of service, then you should be able to use those formula dollars to do expansion and other innovative activities. Also, we've seen what happens when you have competitor grant programs, which allow metropolitan areas, local cities, who may not be the state DOTs, like the Tiger program, to have access and actually allow major innovation. So having an all-the-above priority, but attach specific priority to each of those buckets is very essential to make this work.
Dr. Geddes, I want to ask you a quick question about reforms to the whole regulatory process. We've already established, and it's pretty much without debate, that the regulatory process in building infrastructure, no matter what it is, water and sewer, roads and bridges, does add layers of cost. What reforms, if you can be kind of specific, 2 or 3 things, what would be the top 2 or 3 things we could do right now to help lower those costs and shorten that time frame to go from, as we say, the military flash to bang?
Yes, so again, I support this notion of one federal decision where there's a lead agency that has responsibility for shepherding that project through the process. And then there's many different agencies that have to be involved in permitting a big project, and that lead agency would help it occur concurrently rather than sequentially, which has drawn out the process, and also putting a time limit, and either make a decision to permit the project or not. And I think the lead federal agency model, or one federal decision is one term that's being used, is a good way to do it. And then I understand just having a target, just saying, just whatever the number of years is, 2, 3 years, probably at most, but certainly 10 years to permit a project is absurd. And it's really hurting the country. And I know the Senate has done some work on this, so I would urge that. But could I circle back to your earlier comment about the federal role? Because it's something that concerns me in my work on policy analysis in infrastructure. People forget who the owners of the infrastructure are. Ownership matters. The federal government actually owns relatively little infrastructure. The entire interstate highway system is owned by the states. Cities own a ton of infrastructure. So they're the ones ultimately who have the responsibility of doing the O&M, the operation and maintenance. I think the federal role is changing more to facilitating state and local governments doing the best they can to take care of it, but also using the latest technology. As we all know, the technology of infrastructure is changing at breakneck speed. We need to encourage state and local governments to adopt that technology more quickly, but also make every dollar of funding that they have go as far as possible. And that's a public-private partnership, in my view, and why I've totally encouraged that. And I think the federal government should do more to encourage PPP use.
Mr. Tomer, before he began to answer that last question of mine, I thought I saw a light bulb come on. Did you have a comment that you want to make?
Yeah, I'll try to be really quick. We tend to, and I love transportation. It's my area I focus the most. But we can't forget these other sectors are there too. So when you talk about the right mix, in particular, this body moved back on funds for local water infrastructure in the 1980s, right? Do we want to bring those back as a question? We're talking a lot about broadband today. Representative Khanna and Representative Smith represent vastly different kind of places in terms of their economic fundamentals. Both mentioned broadband, right? But what does that mean when typically the private sector delivers that right now, but we know it's not reaching every community? So talking about that mix, it really depends which one you're talking about. And I actually think, to conclude really quick, I think Dr. Geddes said it well. Because the ownership is state, local, and private, what are the incentives for scalability that makes sense for the federal government? What is that future competitiveness that you all care about, and how can you incentivize that as local action? Those can be really good North Stars here.
My final question, I know I've gone a little bit over, but I want to come back to Ms. Haddock for just a minute, because she said something in her testimony that I think kind of got lost on this audience today, and I want to credit her for mentioning it. It's not in your prepared remarks. She talked about a rescission that's going to happen beginning in October of 2020, that last year of the FAST Act, $7.5 billion. Sometimes Congress can get it its own way, can it not? So I'll give you just a few seconds to elaborate.
So right now, if no action is taken, there will be a $7.6 billion annual loss to transportation funding for 10 years. That will impact all 50 states. It will impact every DOT throughout the nation. And ASCE and many of our partners are specifically asking that Congress take action to eliminate the rescission, to make sure that that is not rescinded, and make sure that we do indeed keep that funding in transportation. I agree with my colleagues here, for the right projects, for the right investments, but to keep that funding in place, do not allow that funding to go away.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to the panel. Mr. Chairman, I just want to congratulate you on having a really good panel. It's kind of nice to be able to finally come into this meeting room and engage a panel where we're not all at each other's throats, and that there's pretty much universal agreement on some of the larger issues that we have. And it must be bipartisan, and if we're going to be successful in its outcome, it will have to be in a bipartisan way. And I thank you for the time this morning.
Sure. Gentlemen, perfectly welcome. Thank you for the discussion. I yield myself now 10 minutes for my question, and start by saying I'm not going to debate the tax cut either, but I do want to respond to many of my colleagues who at every hearing mention the fact that we haven't passed a budget. In fact, we do have a congressional budget in place. It was the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2019, which established reasonable discretionary limits and the usual controls on other spending and revenues, and 65 of my Republican colleagues voted for it. And we also have passed appropriations bills for 96% of the federal discretionary budget. So we certainly, I think, have indicated to the public what our values are in the majority. I love where this discussion went. My stock speech, when I'm speaking at home, begins with my assessment that we're at a very interesting juncture in our history where our past is catching up with us and the future is here, got here faster than we anticipated. And in areas such as infrastructure and race relations, immigration policy, our past is catching up with us. And on the other hand, climate change is happening and having an impact far sooner than we thought. Artificial intelligence is here far sooner than we thought, and a lot of technological changes are here before we thought they were. Self-driving vehicles. I remember when I got here and somebody mentioned a self-driving vehicle, And do we need to start thinking about policies for that? And they said, oh, that's 25 or 30 years away. And of course, it's already here. And so I always say we have a real significant problem in Congress because at our optimum efficiency, we move at 10 miles an hour. I would argue that with Mitch McConnell, my senator, and in charge of the Senate, it's 2 miles an hour. But anyway, it's very slowly, and the world's moving at 100 miles an hour. So how do we make policy that can possibly accommodate the pace of change? And I've often said we need futurists in Congress so that we can start making policy, or at least discussing policy, in a way that is done in the context of knowing what's about to happen, or having a sense of what's likely to happen in the near future. And we generally make policy as if nothing's going to change. And that's I think, the danger that a lot of people look at infrastructure spending. And this panel, of course, is fully aware of the changes that are impacting what we do. And I also use the example of high-speed rail. My vice chairman here talked about high-speed rail. And there are a lot of people who think we ought to be investing in it, but then we have self-driving vehicles, which means most likely in 20 years we will have self-driving vehicles that can go 200 miles an hour, in which case who's going to take a high-speed train? And because you can get there faster just summoning your car, taking off, and that doesn't mean we shouldn't consider making investments in high-speed rail, but it also means that 30 years from now, it may look like the dumbest money we ever spent. And I think about that in your comment, Ranking Member, about vertical takeoffs. We still, it's science fiction, but I saw a video the other day of somebody who was in a flying vehicle. And who knows how long that will take to impact what we do. So I'm really interested, Ms. Haddock, in getting a hold of your projects, your forecasts, because I think that's something that the Congress could well utilize. I don't have too many questions because you've all been sitting here a long time, but one of the things that, and several people have asked the ones I wanted to talk to, but Mr. Coase, you referenced Louisville in your testimony, and one of the things that is very special about that project in Louisville, in the southwestern part of the community, which for my entire life, which is now getting up there pretty long, basically isolated a huge portion of the population in our county from the rest of the community. Because it was virtually impossible for them to conveniently get to downtown to share all the amenities that we shared, to get to parks, to get to so forth. And that was one of the items that we mentioned in making the case for the Tiger Grant, which is facilitating this project, that it wasn't just economics. This was very much a cultural and sociological impact that it was going to have. And I think about things like the health impact of transportation. I hear constantly from people who have such a hard time getting to their doctor, to the hospital, to get their checkups, to get their dialysis, what happens to be. And then on the job and the employment front, however many people have a very, very difficult time taking a job because of transportation. And we have a decent bus system in my community, but not a great one. And I was astounded to hear the other day about somebody who's an ex-felon being reintroduced into society, very much employable, has a job, working his way back, and he takes a bus 2.5 hours every day to and from. 5 hours he spends on a bus, and he lives 20 miles from his place of employment. So there's so many aspects to this subject that I'm glad we're talking about it. I just want a quick question. I'm going to yield some time to the Vice Chairman. When we're talking about the kind of the rehabilitation aspect of this of infrastructure, so we have 600,000 bridges that are in need of repair, $2 trillion to catch up. How did some of your revenues suggestions applied to those things? I mean, it's hard to put a toll on a bridge that's been there for 50 years and you're fixing. What are the options for doing that kind of so providing that kind of funding?
Yes, Congressman. So that's one of the main reasons why I stressed the asset recycling and value capture aspects of my testimony, because it's very difficult politically to toll a currently free facility. It's possible if you add a lane, if you add capacity, to have tolled new capacity. But existing capacity, it's very hard. But of course, these bridges are old, and they need a lot of operation and maintenance. So if you structure a asset recycling program that focuses on generating value from the existing infrastructure, which has been managed in a certain way for decades, and where new techniques, whether it's lease, it doesn't have to be a sale, it could be selling an old parking garage or a parking lot. Just doing the inventory, there's kind of a famous example. New York City did an audit and discovered that the city owned 1,100 vacant lots in the city. Now that's just inefficient use of the asset. And then, of course, the next step is to figure out what's the best use, right? So an asset recycling program includes all of those things. The key word, recycling, means taking those resources, keeping them within that governmental entity, but putting them back into the infrastructure that needs it the most. So if it's an old bridge that is, the ASCE tells us is in trouble, get that bridge properly operated and maintained. So my proposals really are about generating as much funding, squeezing as much funding as you can out of the existing infrastructure with new and innovative management techniques.
I thank you for that, and I yield the rest of my time to the ranking member, the vice chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Coase, I just wanted to go back to you quickly. Foot Traffic Ahead 2019 was released in June, and it demonstrates the links between socially equitable communities, walkability of neighborhoods, accessible, affordable transit options. Denver has invested $5.5 billion in light rail, commuter rail, bus rapid transit. They're ranked as the second most walkable metro area in the U.S. Boston has an 83% real estate premium generally and a 74% GDP per capita premium over the lowest ranked city in the foot traffic index. So what are these links among accessibility of transit, walkability, and economic opportunity and development?
Thank you for that question, Congressman. Here's the reality we've learned in the real estate industry. We're in a fierce global competition for talent. Talent has a specific location it wants to be in today. And it's an environment that allows them to interact with each other, be able to actually walk down 8th Street and actually have a drink during an 8th Street festival while actually coming up with the idea and not have to do it with a car. Maybe a car is involved. Unfortunately, in America, we have very few locations, both in our rural areas and also in our major urban cores, that actually meet that market demand. And what we're seeing, both here in the United States but across the globe, that those who are higher educated, those who are looking for opportunity, are gravitating to cities that have these options. Unfortunately, in your case, in Boston Metropolitan, is that because we have few places, the rents of those places are going so high, cannot keep up with the market demand, and are actually pushing the residents who have been there for so long, the businesses that have been so long, out into environments that actually causes them to spend more money on transportation, therefore creating a cycle of poverty that they can't get out of.
So a great example is, and when this has happened in Manhattan, a lot of people move to Brooklyn. Well, the city of Lynn I represent is exactly the same distance by train from downtown Boston as Brooklyn is from downtown Manhattan. But there's one train an hour. So it's not, imagine if the 7 train, just one of the lines to Brooklyn ran once an hour. So that doesn't work so well. And incidentally, Mr. Chairman, this kind of gets at the issue, the hypothetical issue you raised with high-speed rail. High-speed rail has a whole bunch of benefits well beyond just the fact that you can get from place A to place B. It influences the kinds of communities that develop around it, and it has major capacity advantages over cars, even if they could go 200 miles an hour, which would be a little bit challenging given that the interstate system was designed for 65. But this is, I think, why we have to get into more of this. And I'm running out of time, but Mr. Geddes, Dr. Geddes, I saw you nodding your head there too. Anything to add on this point?
Well, in general, and it's Congressman Yarmouth's point as well about looking to the future, and I urge us to do that in the strongest possible terms. And just as an indication of what I think is the future, I formed a 501c3 nonprofit with a couple of colleagues to do research on the Hyperloop, right? People say, oh, it's crazy or whatever, but the high-speed rail is pushing a column of air in front of this train. It's old technology. There's innovations going on in this sector that are astounding and occurring much faster than we think. So if we're thinking ahead, I would urge Congress to put more money into research on those sorts of technologies. I remember a couple of years ago, people said you're crazy.
Look, I totally agree with you. I do think you should talk to the Japanese about maglev because they're a little ahead of us, and I think they have some questions about Hyperloop.
Get my point.
Yes,
We should leapfrog on that technology.
Great. I'd love to yield time to the ranking member.
I know this hearing is about to come to an end. I meant to ask a question of Dr. Geddes earlier. You talked very briefly about tax increment financing. Why are we not seeing more TIF work? And maybe there is around the country, certainly not in our state. And the problem in our state is that we have a uniform rate of taxation on property tax, and the first 25 mills or whatever goes into the education pool, so the ability to bond projects is limited by the remaining property tax. So why don't we see more?
That's a great question, Congressman. To Mr. Moulton's point, I was at a meeting in Boston where Boston has used there's all these flavors of tax increment financing that I frankly don't fully understand, but Boston communities have used it to increase transit access in Boston in a very successful way. Now to your question, Congressman, why haven't other communities? I think so much is education. It's just about understanding a new delivery technique. I love the state and local infrastructure asset owners that I deal with all the time, but there's a traditional way of delivering projects in the United States that involves tax-exempt municipal bonds. It involves what's called design, bid, build, a bidding process that I don't have time to get into. But I think a lot of it is just getting these ideas out there, getting education, and then just putting the policies in place that facilitate this. But I think tax increment financing could be used much more extensively, has been used in Boston and other cities, and is being used around the world to fund the infrastructure. So the key is it's a funding technique. So I'm not sure I have a full answer for you.
Great. Well, I thank the ranking member for that contribution, and I want to remind all the members, all three of us who are here, that if we have any questions, we could submit them in writing to the witnesses, and they would respond within 7 days. And with that, I want to thank the witnesses again. It's been a very stimulating discussion and hearing, and I thank you for your time and your wisdom. And without objection, this hearing is adjourned.
Thank you, Chairman.
Appreciate it. Thank you.